So it's the Peoria County Family Justice Center Steering Committee, the Pleasant Valley School District. I met the superintendent today. Karen Kaiser, your Volunteer of the Year, and I congratulate all of you, all of you. And for the 100 people who are on the staff and volunteers, if my mom were here, God love her, she'd look at you and she'd say this and she'd mean it. You're doing God's work. If there's anything that's doing God's work, it's what you're doing. You know, I think of all of you who are working at the center here at for prevention of abuse, and it brings me back. It brings me back to trying to get the Violence Against Women passed in the first place. You know, early on in this process, and I might add, as I said, there's nothing I have done in my career, not that my career has been that eventful, but nothing that I have done that matters more to me, that I am more proud of, that I've been involved in public life, than this legislation. In my family, I was raised, and all of you were brought to this issue different ways. Different ways. In my family, I was raised by a dad who was, everybody thinks it was the women in my life and who moved me in this direction. It was actually my father. My father was a gentleman who never raised his hand to any of his children. And my father used to have a number of expressions, one of which is it takes a small man to hit a child or raise his hand to a woman. It takes a small man to hit a child or raise a hand to a woman. My dad, to my dad, as I said earlier, the single greatest sin you could commit was to abuse the power you had, whether it was economic power or whether it was political power or whether it was physical power. And the cardinal sin of all was to raise your hand to someone who trusted you. Raise your hand to someone who should have felt that within your orbit, within your purview, they were totally, thoroughly safe. You know, all the psychiatric studies show that a woman, or a child for that matter, or a person, period, who's abused by someone who institutionally they should be able to respect, who they knew, it takes much more time and it's much more difficult to overcome the psychological scars from that than if you are brutally raped by a stranger who you never encountered before. Ladies and gentlemen, during the late 70s and 80s, the criminal justice system, as Dick would, I think, attest to, has been sort of we all go to Congress and we go, something takes us there, 3 reasons why we wanted to go. And one of the issues for me was the rising tide of violence in America and my conviction that you could be tough on violence and still honor civil liberties and the Constitution. And so when I got to the Congress, I asked to be on the Judiciary Committee, and I spent the bulk of my time in the Congress working on constitutional issues and criminal justice issues in the courts. And during the late 70s and early 80s, with the advent of the crack epidemic and methamphetamines and others, what happened was there was an incredible rise, a spike in gratuitous violence. It used to be that if in the 60s and 70s someone held you up for your wallet, you gave them your wallet and they left you alone. What was happening with regularity all through America was someone walked into a store to rob a store, gets what they need, and then shoots the clerk. Or then so the violence was spiking in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s. And I held hundreds of hours of hearings on why that was the case. And then one day in '85, I think it was, a report came across my desk from an outfit called the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It keeps all the data on crime, the nature of the crime and the frequency and the location, et cetera. And I thought I had been looked to by most of the Congress as, quote, the expert on the criminal justice system. And I was startled when I read that, I think it was '86 actually, that violent crime in America against women between the ages of 18 and 30 had gone up almost 100%. Yet violent crime against males that same age category went down 9%. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, this is not an equal opportunity employer crime. Why was this? What was the cause of this phenomenon? And I started to hold hearings. And I held hearings about why this has occurred. And I found out, maybe a lot of you knew it, but I found out that one of the reasons is the women's movement had empowered women to come forward more frequently and report that they've been abused. But also that abuse actually was way up. It was an epidemic in America. So I went out and I sought the help of an awful lot of leaders. I went to the national organizations. I told them I was writing and I had drafted a Violence Against Women Act. And every single leading organization, progressive organization, from the Association of University Women to the civil rights groups to NOW to all of the women's groups, none of them would endorse the legislation. I got no help. There were various reasons for that. Some of the women's groups thought it would trump the issue of gender and choice. Some of the civil rights organizations didn't like the idea that I was including this as a civil rights violation as well, that if I believed that if a woman was violated, could prove it in a civil court, she should be able to receive damages. You should be able to take the SOB's house or car or his bankroll or whatever. But I realized I was treading on thin ice. I was breaking sort of a sacred, going through a sacred wall there. And I got involved in politics because of the civil rights movement in my state. And I was having great difficulty. So you know what I did? I got invited to speak to a group like all of you who work for the center here in Rhode Island. Those women and men who tended to the needs, and you've been around since 1974, who, as a rape crisis center, attended to the needs of the women who were being violated and abused. Then I went out to Seattle, Washington, and I spoke to them as well. And I got not the big named organizations, but those of you who every day see the pain and the fear and the aftermath of what domestic violence does. And you were like a wave that started to roll across the country from east and west. And all of a sudden, Dick, I had a meeting in my office with the same 7 organizations I've been trying to get to support this for 2 years. And Ellie Schmiel deserves the bulk of the credit, say, why aren't we helping this guy? And from that point on, things began to change. But it was because of you who look those women in the eye, who see the fear, who understand the panic, who hear, I can't move out. Where will I take my children? What will I do? How can I call? Please don't let my husband know I came. You turn the tide, and you continue to turn the tide. And I have nothing but admiration for you. We held the first hearing on June 20th, 1990. And it was apparent from the outset that we not only had an epidemic of violence on our hand, we had a severe cultural problem in this country. I used to be a public defender as a young lawyer. And I learned early on from the seasoned lawyers, if you defended a rape case, make sure you get men on the jury, not women. Because women tend to blame women. And so I realized it was much, much worse than I'd anticipated. We found there were 3 overwhelming hurdles to get the legislation passed, and you deal with them every day, those of your providers. One was, this is a family matter. And that was the days when the Christian Coalition was riding very high, and they didn't like us mucking around and telling them how you could or could not discipline your wife.